And tell us a little bit about the book, because it's quite a specific topic, and I want you to tell it, so I'm not going to say it. But is it drawn from your own personal experiences? How did you find the voice that created this authentic thing that's gone so well in the book? Like, was that something that you've experienced personally, or where did you draw from in the inspiration of it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that life experiences is all you really have as an artist to draw from. And you take that, I think you throw it into a pot with other books you've read, other voices that have stood out to you, other films that you've seen, maybe other, art galleries that you've walked through and stood mesmerized in front of a painting or a sculpture. And you take all those feelings and stir it up in a cauldron. And then that's you, because in some ways we are influenced. We can't say that, oh, this is a brand new, my story is just another story of loss and grief and really, a love story about passion and in some ways and an awakening to life through grief, and it's not that it's not been told before. I just use my voice, which is a big amalgamation of everything I've experienced and the art that I've been influenced by. Nothing is brand new.
No, totally. I think it's a really lovely thing to talk about and to like put out there, because I think there's this. I think maybe this is something about kids. Maybe what you're saying about them having this kind of fear going out there in the world. There's sort of a fear or like a huge pressure to create something novel. Like there's good, like you got to reinvent the wheel, whatever you're going to do. And it means that it stops people just getting started on something. And I think like when you get started on something like you've done of your entire life, things come, things happen. And I think there's a part of the funneling that we have for kids these days is that we've ended up kind of narrowing their scope so much before they even get to broaden it out. So that there's never that kind of like exploratory, joyful kind of like, maybe I'm great at painting and I've never touched a canvas in my life. Or maybe I'm actually just like a born engineer and I'm just like fascinated by bridges. But there's this sense that you have to like, whatever you do from 18 years on is like, that's your road and that's your career. Yeah. I think it's really important. It's really good to have role models like yourself that are out there who've done like, no, I did this for a while, then I did this, then I looked at that. And then like, just like uncovering your passion, I suppose, as you go. I think that's such an important thing and a great thing to discover. Also, I think a lot of the essence of people, and maybe this is speaking a bit too personally from my point of view, but that we find our essence sometimes through grief. And so this thing that we have in culture where we're not allowed to necessarily, Western culture, let's say, encounter grief and allow it to inform us. We kind of have to like layer over it and move on from it, as opposed to like finding some essence that can actually be quite creative within that, because that's the death and rebirth thing, right? That's how life has gone for tens of millions of years, really. And it's the stories we've always told as humans. But there's a kind of a sense that like, we have to be right as a button and we have to find our channel, find our lane and stick in it, like from early, right?
Yeah. That's really interesting. I love what you said about how you find yourself, through the process. I love thinking about story in the same way that, when you start writing or when you start probably painting, you don't necessarily, you have sort of this idea of what you want to do, but you don't necessarily know exactly how you're going to get there. And I think that that's the unknown journey that you have to say yes to every time you sit down to work on it, is that I don't know where I'm going. And that should both be exciting and sort of terrifying all at once, and so I was always looking at my book as almost this mirror of what I am as a person, like that you kind of chisel away at yourself to find yourself. I chisel away at my story, like it's in there. It's like that big piece of marble, and you make out a cheekbone or a nose and chisel away at that, and you find the other features. And I think that, I was always feeling that way through the process of writing. It was almost like taking on the journey of writing was taking on this inward journey of myself that was parallel, going parallel to what, tracking along as I was on the journey of writing.
And tell us about your day with writing. How do you do it? I know like one of the writers I remember hearing about, I think it was it Nuala O'Faolain or one of these big Irish writers. Yeah, possibly. Or Maeve Binchy. No, it was Maeve Binchy. And she,
wow.
Yeah, so herself and her husband, right? They both were writers, but in very different areas. And they would sit down, they were in their 60s or 70s. They were still productive. They would sit down in an office space, a studio space beside each other, and they would write for the morning. They'd take a break for lunch. They'd come back and write for the afternoon, and then they'd assess each other's pieces.
Wow.
Yeah, brutal. And they do that every
Oh,
day. They have this like
wow.
really rigid adherence to this thing, and then they were allowed something like 15 minutes to have a grump after that, because often they'd be, you're dealing with somebody you've lived with for a long time, you
Yeah.
know their ins and outs. It's
I
very
would
easy
not
to
be able to do that with my husband. Let's just say that right now. That would be.
interesting. But just wondering, how does your writing process go? Do you have a very strict writing process? Is it very fluid? Is it like, wake up today, I want to do it, tomorrow I don't? How does it go?
Yeah. Well, I had to be very strict with myself in the beginning because it became really clear after I talked about wanting to write my story, write the book for a long time. Years went by of kind of just saying, yeah, I want to write it. I'm going to try to do this. But I would allow all of life's distractions to get in the way because it's hard work. And I think it's hard work partly because if you're writing something good, you are sort of doing a lot of work inside yourself and trying to figure yourself out, because a lot of you ends up on those pages. And if a lot of you is a mystery, a lot of you is a mystery we don't necessarily want to uncover, And so I feel like I was in some ways all of the characters and I was none of the characters, because none of them were necessarily wholly me. But what I believe is that for my process, which I'd actually like to get back into, but there's so many different hats you wear when you write something and then you promote it and then all of a sudden life creeps back in and I'm writing less and less and less every day. But when I did decide to sit down and write, I wrote a rough draft and I was sharing some pages sort of off and on. And I also took a lot of classes. I took class after class after class. And some of them weren't even necessarily about novel writing. Some of them were essay writing, but they were all making me sit down to write. And all of them were making me produce pages and get assessed with a small group of people, which I think is healthy. Some people don't like doing that, but I actually think it's healthy because, in some ways when we first start writing, we tend to think every word is precious. And the reality is that just write the damn story, stop getting hung up on how you're going to phrase this or that. Write the story because there's always the editing process. I mean, writing is really rewriting all the time. You just choose one day to stop or you just even say it's close enough. It's never perfect. You just say, okay, now it's time to move on. This one's done. It's, you're always going to look back and say, well, I wonder if I should have done this with this character. Should that man have been a woman or that woman have been a man? Like all these things that go through your mind. It's, letting go is another part of the process, letting go of what you created. And it's, and it's hard for people to do. It's really hard for perfectionists to do, and I think it's also hard just because you've lived with these characters for so long and you've lived with this world and then to put a cap on it and say, okay, well, it's done. And it's got to get, it's got to go on to the next phase at some point. It's hard. So I tend to write best in the morning when I'm working on new content. If I'm editing or doing revisions, it can kind of be, especially if I'm back and forth with an editor. If an editor is sending me notes on pages, then I can do that after dinner. I can do that even with the television, but when I'm writing new content, this is my space right here. In the summertime, I'm in a gazebo out in the middle, looking over a bay, which is nice, although it's not quite what Stephen King said in his book on writing, which is, he said the quietest room with no windows, which for him ended up like being a closet that he cleaned out in his house. And I do need that. I do need that. We're like, I think it's like a womb. You've got your room and then you've got your womb. And the womb is better for, germinating a story. For when you don't have all these windows to look out. It does change your brain, and what's going on in your brain when there's, something to look out all the time at. But with, like a tent or a room, like with no window or tiny window, you just don't have any real distractions.